Paul McCartney. To the world, he's the charming Beatle, the songwriter whose melodies defined an era, and the artist whose music has touched generations. Songs like Let It Be and Hey Jude became anthems of hope and unity. Paul was always seen as the nice one, the Beatle who carried himself with humor, grace, and optimism. But beneath that polished image lies a story few dare to explore. For Paul, life in the Beatles wasn't just about love and peace, it was also about rivalry, control, and deep emotional wounds. And at the center of one of those wounds stood a woman he could not tolerate. Someone who, in his eyes, disrupted the sacred bond he had with John Lennon and drove a wedge into the world's most beloved band. That woman was Yoko Ono. To John, she was a muse, a partner, and the love of his life. To Paul, she was an invader, an influence he neither wanted nor respected. And as the years unfolded, the tension between Paul and Yoko grew into one of the most infamous feuds in music history. This is not just the story of a rock band in crisis. It's the tale of friendship, rivalry, and the one person, Paul McCartney's name is forever linked with harmony, both musical and personal. Since the earliest days of the Beatles, Paul had cultivated the image of being approachable, cheerful, and endlessly creative. Fans adored him not just for his voice and songwriting, but for his personality. He was the Beatle who smiled on stage, who reassured interviewers, and who seemed to carry the band's message of peace and love into everything he did. But beneath that light-hearted exterior was a man far more complex. Paul was ambitious, sometimes fiercely so. He didn't just want to write great songs. He wanted them to be the best. He didn't just want to be a Beatle. He wanted to guide the group, to keep their legacy alive, to be the leader who ensured they never lost their way. His work ethic was unmatched. While the others sometimes drifted or grew distracted, Paul was the one pushing late-night recording sessions, fine-tuning arrangements and demanding excellence. That drive, however, often created tension. John Lennon, in particular, felt the weight of Paul's determination. Their relationship was one of the most complex partnerships in music history. On one hand, John and Paul were inseparable collaborators. Together, they produced timeless hits, balancing each other's strengths in a way that felt almost magical. On the other hand, they were rivals, constantly competing for dominance, for recognition, for control over the direction of the band. By the mid-1960s, that rivalry had begun to intensify. John wanted freedom, to push the boundaries of what music could be. Paul wanted structure, melody, and broad appeal. These creative differences didn't break the band, but they laid the groundwork for fractures that would later become impossible to ignore. And into this fragile environment stepped Yoko Ono. Yoko was unlike anyone the Beatles had encountered before. She was an avant-garde artist, deeply involved in experimental music, performance art, and conceptual projects. Her world was far removed from the polished pop and rock landscape the Beatles had dominated. When John fell in love with her, he embraced not only her as a partner, but her philosophy and her artistic vision. For Paul, this was both baffling and threatening. The Beatles had always kept their personal lives separate from the studio. Wives and girlfriends rarely, if ever, attended recording sessions. The studio was sacred, a space where four young men worked as one, a creative laboratory where only their voices mattered. But when John brought Yoko into that space, the unspoken rule was broken. Paul noticed immediately. Yoko didn't just sit quietly in the background. She was beside John, offering input, suggesting ideas, sometimes even speaking for him. In Paul's eyes, this was unthinkable. It wasn't just about her being present. It was about her inserting herself into the band's most intimate process. At first, Paul tried to remain polite. He knew John was infatuated, and he didn't want to alienate his friend. But as the days turned into weeks, Paul began to feel an unmistakable shift. John was changing. Decisions that once belonged to the band now seemed to flow through Yoko. Where Paul once felt like John's equal, he now felt like an outsider. And that feeling of being pushed out of his own creative family was something Paul could not tolerate. Paul's resentment grew quietly but steadily. He began confiding to close friends that Yoko's presence disrupted the chemistry of the group. He felt that she was eroding the brotherhood that had sustained them since Liverpool, replacing it with something alien and uncomfortable. And for a man as protective of the Beatles as Paul, that was unforgivable. This was the beginning of a long, bitter feud. Paul McCartney, the Beatle of peace and love, was discovering a side of himself that rarely surfaced in public: resentment, bitterness, and eventually, outright hatred. And it all began with Yoko Ono. I once admitted he could not stand more than anyone else. When John Lennon met Yoko Ono in 1966, his life changed forever. She wasn't like anyone else in his world. Yoko was bold, experimental, and uncompromising in her art. She didn't just admire John for being a Beatle, she challenged him, pushed him, and made him question the very foundations of his creativity. For a man who often felt trapped inside the image of John Lennon of the Beatles, Yoko represented liberation. But while John felt energized, Paul McCartney felt increasingly alarmed. To Paul, the Beatles were more than just a band. They were a sacred bond. He had grown up with John, shared his earliest dreams with him, and together they had conquered the world. Their partnership wasn't simply professional, it was personal, a brotherhood built on shared struggles and triumphs. And now Paul sensed that this bond was under threat. In the recording studio, the changes were immediate. Yoko wasn't content to remain in the background like the other Beatles' wives and girlfriends. She sat beside John, whispering into his ear, commenting on takes, even suggesting musical ideas. For Paul, this was more than unusual, it was offensive. The studio was supposed to be their private world, a place where only the four Beatles shaped the music. Suddenly, that world was invaded. The tension became especially visible during the recording of the White Album in 1968. Unlike earlier records, which had been marked by collaboration, the White Album was fragmented. Each Beatle seemed to be working on his own songs, often with little input from the others. Paul noticed that John, once his closest collaborator, was drifting further away, and at the center of that distance was Yoko. Paul struggled to understand John's obsession. Yoko's avant-garde style clashed with everything he valued in music. Where Paul loved melody, harmony, and structure, Yoko celebrated dissonance, noise, and abstraction. To Paul, it sounded more like chaos than art. He once joked that while he wrote songs people could sing, Yoko was making tape loops of birds screaming. It was a cutting remark, but it revealed just how baffled and irritated he was by John's devotion to her work. But it wasn't just the music. It was the way Yoko seemed to consume John entirely. The two were inseparable, often speaking for one another, sometimes even finishing each other's sentences. For Paul, who had once shared that closeness with John, this was painful to witness. He felt pushed aside, as though his role in John's life had been replaced. That sense of replacement stung deeply. Paul had always seen himself as John's partner, the one who balanced him, who brought out his best ideas. Now it seemed Yoko had taken that place. And in Paul's mind, she wasn't just a partner, she was a rival. The rest of the band noticed the shift as well. George Harrison and Ringo Starr also felt uncomfortable with Yoko's constant presence, but it was Paul who took it the hardest. His clashes with John grew more frequent and more heated, with Yoko often silently sitting by, her presence fueling Paul's frustration. Behind closed doors, Paul complained bitterly. Friends later recalled how he spoke of Yoko as if she were dismantling the very fabric of the Beatles. To him, she wasn't simply a girlfriend. She was a wedge, deliberately or not, driven between him and John. By 1969, the atmosphere in the studio had grown toxic. Recording sessions for Let It Be were filled with tension, arguments, and long silences. At one point, George even temporarily quit the band. Paul, desperate to keep the group together, tried to assert more control, but this only pushed John and Yoko further away. For Paul, the situation became unbearable. He felt as though Yoko had hijacked not just John's attention, but the very soul of the Beatles. What had once been the tightest partnership in music history was now unraveling before his eyes, and in Paul's heart, admiration gave way to bitterness. Frustration turned into anger, and that anger hardened into something darker: hatred. To Paul McCartney, Yoko Ono was no longer just John's partner. She had become the embodiment of everything he feared: loss, disruption, and the destruction of the Beatles. By 1969, the fractures inside the Beatles were no longer hidden. What had once been a tight-knit brotherhood was now a battlefield, and at the heart of much of the conflict stood Yoko Ono. To John, she was his muse and his partner in everything. To Paul, she was the person who had driven an almost unbreakable wedge between him and his closest collaborator. The cracks showed most vividly during the Let It Be sessions. Intended to be a return to live, stripped-down performances, the project quickly descended into chaos. The cameras captured it all: Paul trying to keep the band focused, John detached and sarcastic, George frustrated, and Ringo silent. And there, always at John's side, was Yoko. She wasn't just watching, she was part of the process, sitting in the circle of musicians, sometimes offering suggestions, sometimes simply existing as a constant reminder to Paul that things would never be the same. For Paul, who valued the sanctity of that creative space, it was infuriating. Every time John looked to Yoko for approval, Paul felt his authority slip away. The partnership that had built the Beatles was dissolving right before his eyes. By April 1970, Paul had had enough. He announced he was leaving the Beatles, marking the official end of the band. In interviews, he rarely named Yoko directly, but his meaning was clear. He spoke of outsiders disrupting the unity of the group, of the bond being broken by forces beyond music. Fans and journalists quickly filled in the blanks. Paul was blaming Yoko. The feud spilled out into the public arena in more direct ways. Music, the medium that had once united John and Paul, became their weapon of choice. In 1971, Paul released Too Many People, a song widely interpreted as a jab at John and Yoko. Its lines about preaching and controlling were seen as Paul's way of mocking their activism and avant-garde lifestyle. John fired back almost immediately with How Do You Sleep, a venomous track that left little to interpretation. Backed by George Harrison on slide guitar, John sneered at Paul, accusing him of making muzak and of being nothing without the Beatles. Yoko's influence was palpable in the bitterness of the lyrics. Paul was devastated. Though he brushed it off in public, privately he admitted how deeply the song had hurt him. To him, it wasn't just John speaking, it was John with Yoko's voice in the background, amplifying the hostility. Meanwhile, the press played up the feud, often framing it as Paul versus Yoko rather than Paul versus John. Tabloids painted Paul as jealous and bitter, unable to accept that Yoko had become the central figure in John's life. Yoko herself didn't shy away from controversy. In interviews, she suggested that Paul had been controlling within the Beatles, that he couldn't handle John's independence, and that she had simply given John the freedom he craved. The battle wasn't only artistic or emotional, it was also financial. After the breakup, disputes over the management of Apple Corps, the Beatles company, created even deeper rifts. Paul often felt ganged up on by John, George, and Ringo, with Yoko whispering advice in John's ear during negotiations. The animosity hardened. Privately, Paul vented to friends that he despised Yoko more than anyone he had ever known. She wasn't just John's wife. She was, in his eyes, the woman who had stolen his partner, dismantled his band, and turned a lifelong friendship into a war. For a man who prided himself on diplomacy and kindness, Paul's hatred was unusual, and it was consuming. By the mid-1970s, the open hostilities began to cool. Paul and John eventually reconciled to some extent, speaking on the phone and even visiting each other occasionally in New York. But even then, Paul admitted that dealing with Yoko was nearly impossible. Whenever John wasn't around, the air between them was cold. To the public, Paul was still the affable Beatle, smiling on stage and writing songs of love and hope. But behind the scenes, he carried a bitterness that never fully went away. Yoko Ono, more than any critic, rival, or business partner, had become the focus of his deepest resentment. This was no ordinary disagreement. For Paul McCartney, it was war, one fought in the press, in the studio, and in the private corners of his heart. The murder of John Lennon in December 1980 shocked the world. For Paul McCartney, it was more than just the loss of a former bandmate. It was the death of a brother. The complicated mixture of rivalry, resentment, and love he had carried toward John suddenly collapsed into grief. But in that grief, another presence remained. Yoko Ono. Paul was criticized at the time for calling John's death a drag when reporters cornered him outside Abbey Road studios. Many misunderstood the remark, thinking Paul was being cold. In reality, he was overwhelmed and unable to put his feelings into words. Behind the scenes, he reached out to Yoko, attempting to bridge the enormous gap between them. But if there was warmth, it was fleeting. In the years following John's death, Paul tried repeatedly to find common ground with Yoko. He understood that she was now the guardian of John's legacy, and he often needed her approval to release archival material or reissues of Beatles recordings. But their interactions were rarely smooth. Paul would later admit that every meeting with Yoko was a negotiation, not only of business but of history itself. One of the most contentious issues was the crediting of Beatles songs. Traditionally, John and Paul had agreed early on to share credit as Lennon-McCartney, no matter who wrote the song. After John's death, Paul suggested that some songs he had largely written, like Yesterday, should sometimes be listed as McCartney-Lennon. To him, it was a small correction to honor his work. To Yoko, it was a betrayal of John's memory. Their public sparring over the issue reignited old wounds. Paul felt dismissed and disrespected. Yoko saw him as trying to rewrite history. And yet, despite the bitterness, there were moments of thaw. In the 1990s, when Paul, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr reunited to work on the Beatles anthology, Yoko played a crucial role. She granted access to John's demo tapes, allowing the surviving Beatles to create 2 new Beatles songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love. Without Yoko's cooperation, the project could never have happened. Paul acknowledged this, even if working with her was difficult. Over time, the hostility between them softened into something closer to reluctant respect. Paul began to publicly recognize Yoko's role in John's life, admitting that John had truly loved her and that she had been his muse. In interviews, he stopped framing her as the villain of the Beatles story. Instead, he focused on the undeniable truth. John had chosen her, and Paul had to accept that. Still, traces of the old bitterness never fully disappeared. Friends close to Paul have said that even decades later, Yoko remained a sore subject. While he no longer spoke with open hatred, there was always a tension, a sense that she had permanently altered the course of his life. Yoko, for her part, occasionally offered surprising kindness. She once called Paul the closest to John, acknowledging the bond they had shared. She even praised some of his solo work, but just as quickly she could reignite conflict. In interviews, she sometimes implied that Paul had been jealous of John, or that his music lacked depth compared to her husband's. Each remark reopened old wounds. By the 2000s and 2010s, with both aging and reflecting on their legacies, Paul and Yoko reached a sort of uneasy peace. They appeared together at Beatles-related events, posed for photographs, and even shared polite words. To the public, it looked like forgiveness. But those who knew Paul best suggest that forgiveness was never complete. He respected Yoko because she was John's great love. He tolerated her because of history. But deep inside, the scars of the late 1960s never fully healed. And perhaps that is the real story, not one of dramatic reconciliation, but of lingering shadows. Paul McCartney, a man defined by songs of love and hope, could never completely erase the bitterness he felt toward the woman who, in his eyes, had ended the greatest partnership in music history. Yet, even with that bitterness, he chose not to live in hate. Instead, Paul honored John through music, memory, and legacy. When asked about Yoko in later years, his answers were careful, even gentle. Because beneath it all, Paul understood one truth. To hate Yoko Ono was, in some way, to hate a part of John Lennon. And that was something he could never truly do.